So hopefully you can see everything there. And what I'm going to be covering tonight is for those people, we've been covering some of the new technologies, but this is actually a bit of a space history um, for a series of books that I are really quite passionate about making people aware of. We're going to be talking about the space flight series that the University of Nebraska developed, and you can see there that I've got a couple of the covers here, and I'll be talking about the actual series and all the different books in it now, for if you weren't aware of them. Um, the University of Nebraska Press started publishing these in about 2008, and the series went through from 2008 to 2021. And believe it or not, the series editor of that was Colin Burgess, who is an Australian, and he was quite a well-known space author, particularly in the Apollo series, which he was very passionate and worked with other people on that. But he's actually the series editor and managed basically all the books that they published. So over the 13 years where it was they started the books coming through. There was 22 books in this series, and I must admit I've actually got 7 of them, um, and some of them come out at different times. So, but there is actually a kind of a method to what they were covering. So, it basically covers all of I suppose you could say, from the 1930s and 40s all the way through to the space shuttle um, and the ISS. So it's really covering a very long period of time in terms of the actual history side of it. Probably so when the space shuttle was retired, so hence the different books coming out in that period of time. Probably I could say it was really 35, 40 years really it's covering in terms of the so there's a number of books out in all of the different eras, I suppose you could call them, and it's trying to give you an idea on what they're about, and maybe anybody wants to get them. I must admit, getting these, I actually ordered all of these, the time ones that I've got through Amazon. I think they might have been available locally through Booktopia and Dymocks, but it possibly is going to be harder to get these now, unless you start looking maybe overseas. But some of them are still around, but I'll just give you an idea what's available and when they came out. Basically, I've got ideas. These two came out in 2020, and they're basically covering the early days. They're rocket pioneers, the 1930s and 40s, and even possibly before that. And the other book called Beyond Blue Skies is really looking at the lifting body planes like the X-15. So these are the two came out a little bit later, but they actually covered early days of the space age, I suppose you can say, or just before it, which is what those two covered. Um, the ones that are probably most well known are the ones on the early days of the US and Russian programs. Francis French wrote they covered a series of years, as you can see, 1961 to 1965, 1965 to 1969, and 1969 to 1975. So the some of the key years in the early days of the space program really being covered here. Francis French wrote the first one, Into That Silent Sea, The Trailblazers of Space. Then there was In the Shadow of the Moon, Challenging Journey to Tranquility. That's essentially the late Gemini and early Apollo missions. Francis French wrote that one as well. And Footprints in the Dust, the epic voyages of the Apollo. Uh, and that Colin Burgess wrote that particular one. All of those books are probably about 400 pages in size, and they've got a lot of pictures in them, and they're fascinating in terms of telling the different mission stories. And if you're interested in space, certainly US space history, they're worth thinking about buying if you can still get them. I've got them and I've read them. They're excellent books. So it's something to be aware of that such books exist. The next one, though, we're covering is the space stations. The first one is called Homesteading in Space, the Skylab story, and that really covers the Skylab missions, the 3 of them. Interestingly enough, the 2 of the co-authors in this David Hitt, Owen Garrett, and Joe Cohen, they're actually two Skylab astronauts. So they've actually written their own perspectives of the missions that they were on with David Hitt about covering all the materials that the Skylab series of missions did. And they're in a similar type of vein in that they cover the missions in detail and with a lot of pictures in them, trying to explain what was going on with those back in the early 1970s when Skylab went up. Um, the other book, which covers a later period, is the Outposts on the Frontier, which is the 50-year history of space stations. That really covers I suppose you could say, the 1950s concept by Werner von Braun. It also goes all the way through talks about obviously a little bit of the Skylab missions, but also talks about um, the Russian space stations. Obviously, the last Russian space station that was Mir, but also the other Salyuts that they had earlier than that. It covers those as well, and also talks about the ISS. So it really covers all the space stations that over that 50-year period, and gives them context, which is fascinating if you want to get information on space stations. And that was by Jake Chaladek. I think that was one of the later books I did get, but there's some other ones that came out after that. But the next phase of books are on the space shuttle. There's actually two of those, and it's covering different age periods. The early years really saying 72 to 86. The reason why it's 72 has been selected there is when actually the space shuttle got selected to be built. It was actually approved about the time of Apollo 16, because I remember John Young remarking about it when he was on the moon, actually talking about the fact that the Congress had approved it to be built. So that's the reason why it starts with that date. And basically, it will cover through to the Challenger disaster, which was in 1986. That's really the building of the shuttles, the first three shuttles, and also I suppose you could say, the first 25 missions. And that's author is David Hitt and Heather Smith, and that came out in 2014. Um, the last missions that were covered in the shuttle program at 1986 to 2011. You can see the dates on that one. That was actually 2011 was the last shuttle mission. That was done by Rick Houston. As another journalist that was well known in the space area. So that's quite a large, and really that covers about 100 space missions that he's encapsulating it. They're not in massive detail, but covering all the technologies that were going on for that. And these, as I said, these books are quite large. I think those other ones are probably about 500 pages, I think, going through to look at. And certainly all those ones that we've last time I've got those books, and they're certainly fascinating. Uh, the other area which people have covered is the Yemen tragedy side. This is the lost and cancelled space missions, of which probably you could say not so much the deaths involved, but there was missions being speculated at one stage, and the Apollo applications program, for example, was cancelled, and there was also some military Gemini based technology missions, which were the MOR program they called that, which was the US Air Force was looking at running that. That was a series of missions that they wanted to run back in the early 1960s, and they cancelled that. It kind of talks about some of the things that might have been if these missions had occurred, and some of the people involved with it that might have had dreams of going to space, but that never happened for that reason because the missions were cancelled. So that's kind of what they're talking about, what the Shattered Dreams is all about. However, there's another book which just covers the fall of fallen astronauts, all the different astronauts who died in the early stages of the space program, some of which died not necessarily like the Apollo 1 astronauts who actually died in the capsule when they were doing tests, but there was also astronauts who died in air accidents just before that. You know, for example, the Gemini 9 crew was rotated because the prime crew actually died in an accident going to visit the place where the capsule was being built, and their jet crashed into the buildings near it, and the backup crew actually had to do the mission with Stafford and Soon, and they were actually the backup crew to the original prime crew for Gemini 9, but they were actually killed in a plane crash. So they talk about some of those astronauts and what the implications were, and there was a couple of astronauts who probably would have been in the Apollo program as well. Alan Bean wasn't the original choice for the Apollo 12 lunar module pilot. There was another guy who was actually prime listed originally, but he actually was killed in a plane crash. So, and these are the things that are covered there, and it's fascinating reading about these people as well. And actually, is that all? Okay, good. No, this has got a couple of pages. I don't know why it's a bit slow. These ones are some of the, although some of the other, I suppose you could say related. Go Flight, the unsung heroes of mission control. That's certainly worth looking at. Milt Heflin was actually one of the mission controllers. So that's talking about the flight controllers, specifically on that. Um, the Ultimate Engineer, uh, which was uh, a book about one of the key engineers that was in the early days of the program that NASA had. Infinity Beacon, adventuring through the inner solar system. That's talking about the early probes uh, that we had. Uh, Ambassadors from the Earth, pioneering explanations of the unmanned spacecraft. Um, and realizing tomorrow the path to private spaceflight, which is, I suppose, something that people are talking about now. That originally that book did come out a few years back, but it's something that people were looking at doing. Uh, More titles here. Come fly with us, NASA's payload specialist program. Now, the payload specialist program was really something that was only happening in the first 25 missions. The term payload specialist disappeared after that because a lot of those people were not what you would call classically trained astronauts, but people that were working for other companies. So it's really talking about the early days of the shuttle program. Um, the Apollo pilot, the memoir of astronaut Don Isley. That's actually probably, I suppose you could say, an autobiography by Don Isley as well. He was the Apollo 7 command module pilot. Long voyage to the moon, the life of naval aviator Ron Evans. So that was really about the Apollo 17 command module pilot. The Light of the Earth, Reflections of Life in Space. That's really a personal thing from Al Warden. He's got another person working with him to make that, but Al was the Apollo 15 command module pilot. So you can see a few command module pilots doing a bit of thinking there. About their, in fact, the last one was about the Stuart Roosa, who was actually the Apollo 14 command module pilot, and his son actually has written about his father. So interesting that those command module pilots wanted to talk about what they thought about the missions going to the moon, although they didn't actually get on the moon's surface, but they obviously did a lot of thinking when they were up there, and they want to talk about how they saw the world, I suppose you could say. So worth you if you're interested in any of those books, certainly they're still available. Some of them are at least. I would be starting to look at Amazon and some of these, but I know from the ones that I've bought, as a series, they're excellent and something to worth um, considering as to in terms of a history of space.